Welcome to Northwest Tech Show. I'm Dave Duncan, and this is a show where we talk about technology and how a better understanding of it can help you have better outcomes at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. We're going to kick things off, as we like to do, with a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at Twit TV.
This is Twit.
Well, chances are if you're listening to this, then you know a thing or two about podcasts. But something very exciting that's happened is that Google Podcasts is coming to, or is here, it's here for iOS. And so we are very excited to talk to the founder and product manager of Google Podcasts, Zach Renaud-Wadene, who's here with us today. Hello, Zach.
Hey, Micah. Thanks for having me on. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, we are so pumped about this. So, I'm a native iOS user. I've used loads of different podcast apps, and I'm curious, what is Google Podcasts bringing to the iOS experience? What is it that makes Google Podcasts unique? What can it do for me as an iOS user?
So I guess yesterday we kind of have three parts of the launch. The first is a little bit less relevant to iOS because it's our first launch on iOS, and that is a redesign of the app around discovery. And we can talk a little bit more maybe in the coming minutes about the podcast discovery problem. Mm-hmm. The second thing that we've done is just add a bunch of features. So the ability to queue up podcasts, the ability to turn on auto downloading, view your listen history, set up push notifications. These are all things that Google Podcasts for Android didn't have until this week, which is rolling out. I think it'll probably roll out to 100% by tomorrow. And so those are kind of the first two parts of the launch. But the third part is that Google Podcasts is available on iPhone for the first time. And we started working on podcasts a few years ago. We first launched Google Podcasts for Android in 2018. So you might be wondering why it took us almost 2 more years to release an iPhone app. And the reason is that with the success that we saw in terms of growth and engagement in Google Podcasts for Android, we also saw a lot of people interested in listening to podcasts when they search on Google. We saw people listening to podcasts through the Google Assistant. And while there are 2 billion people around the world who have Android devices, and that's a massive opportunity, we also want to make sure that we're serving users who might have, let's say, a smart speaker like a Google Home, but also an iPhone. Micah, I'm sure since you host a tech podcast, your iPhone is probably not your only device that you have. Is that a fair assumption?
That is an absolutely fair assumption as I look around and see all of these devices listening.
So for someone like you, you might listen to podcasts that are over an hour long. You might want to start one on your computer, pick up on your phone. You might be cooking dinner and you want to ask Google Assistant to play your podcast and pick up where you left off. And so, especially for podcasts, which can be such a rich, long form type of media, we want to make sure that any user, whether they're using Google for all of their devices or just for some of them, can use Google Podcasts. So that's a big part of it. The other part of it, honestly, is on the publisher side too. If you're going to have your podcast on Google Podcasts and you want to tell users where they can get it, you want to make sure that player is universally available. And we have a pretty strong belief. It's, one of the words in Google's mission is universal, making the world's information universally accessible and useful. And so we feel like podcasts are a universal medium the same way as radio. And so it's not just sort of tactical, it's also bubbles up to a higher level of strategy for podcasts, but also for Google as a company.
Excellent. Now, one of the first thing you mentioned in the article, and I was kind of reading along and going, yes. You say it took me a decade to find the podcasts I love most. And so one of the features that Google Podcasts is rolling out is a way that makes it easy for you to find shows that you will genuinely enjoy. And I'm curious, does this go down to the episode level? Is it a podcast as a whole kind of recommendation? And do you want to just talk about this feature in general and why you're so excited about it?
Yeah, so I mean, you can see from the blog post, like this was kind of a fun blog post to write for me because it also allowed me to kind of take a trip down memory lane and think about what I was listening to 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when I think getting into podcasts was really required a different level of energy. But it still requires a lot more energy, I think, than getting into YouTube or Twitter or Instagram or these services that have really figured out discovery to a much greater degree than we have in podcasting. And so if you'd asked me 2 years ago when we first launched Google Podcasts on Android, I would sort of have to talk my way around the fact that we did show recommendations primarily based on what else you were listening to, which is great once you get into podcasts because it says, oh, you listen to this, you might also like that. And those are good recommendations. But it doesn't address two things. The first one is that if you're not already into podcasts, there isn't necessarily a listening history with which to give you new recommendations. So it doesn't solve the cold start problem. And then the second thing is that when you operate at the show level, you actually miss out on a lot of relationships that could be formed between a listener and a podcaster. So to give you an example, there's a podcast that I used to listen to. I still listen to it sometimes, but it's called You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes. It's kind of like comedy, spirituality, culture, lifestyle, and he's very entertaining. He's a good host. And the reason that I got into that podcast is because he did an interview in particular with Aaron Rodgers, who's the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. And I'm a sports fan. And so I was willing to dip a toe in and see, oh, who's this Pete Holmes guy? Because I was so interested in the interview with Aaron Rodgers. And they talked about all these weird things. I've talked about this before. They talked about trying the Impossible Burger and what Aaron Rodgers thought of that. And this was a few years ago, so most people hadn't tried that yet. And so then suddenly I was like, oh, this Pete Holmes guy is pretty interesting. And I ended up getting into the show. But that wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for getting the specific episode recommendation. So the way that we address these two problems with the launch yesterday is number one, the same way you would get recommendations for articles to read through Discover, which is like the Google feed of articles, or through Google News. Also, your Google profile is taken into account when you first use Google Podcasts to try to connect you with podcasts that you'll like, even if you don't have a listening history already. And then the second piece of it is that we go straight to the episode. So we actually recommend specific episodes that we think you'll like.
Nice.
And that, I think, is a really good gateway to figuring out if you want to listen to a show. Whereas the prevailing paradigm before yesterday, I think, is that you would start from the most recent episode or the oldest episode. And that's not always the best episode to start with for each person. It's a much more personal problem.
Yeah, so I really like that, and to have it go to a specific episode is really nice. And I guess that's one of the questions I'm curious about. Does the discovery feature sort of improve over time in a way that it can continue to recommend, specific episodes based on, am I getting a better discover feature over time versus what it initially learns about me?
Yes. So the component that we talked about at the beginning, which is your listening history, is another component. And I think, while your interests are a great signal for what podcasts you want to listen to, there's not always a perfect overlap. To give you an example, I really like to listen to podcasts about sports, but I wouldn't necessarily say that in general, I want all my other content to be about sports also. So what happens for me when I'm a new user is I actually get suggested a lot of stuff that's about coding and programming. And this makes sense because that's what I'm into more generally. But oftentimes I like to use podcasts actually to take a break from that. And maybe if I'm going on a run or cooking and just zoning out for a bit, And so as you listen to more podcasts in the app, it'll be much more contextual for what you actually want for podcasts. Whereas the best guess when you just first start is going to be a little more generalized. So the short answer I would say is we try to do the best job we can when you don't have a rich listening history, but we also try to improve as you develop one.
One of the cool features that we see is being able to do Google searches, and you can, ask a question or look up a topic, and it will now start to take you directly to a point in a YouTube video where they talk about that specific thing. So it's sort of doing transcription and lets you do searches that way. Is this something that we'll see in Google Podcasts as well?
That's a really good point and an interesting observation. So it's useful in YouTube. The one that I've used the most often is how to tie a bow tie. I think
yes.
The last few times I finally graduated to like the static image tutorial, whereas I needed like the full video.
Right.
But that one like jumps you to a specific point in the video where it's most useful to you. And that's definitely something that I think would be really useful to bring to podcasting as well. And one thing that's important to highlight there is that process requires a lot of input from publishers. So as we develop more of these features that take the technology to the next level, we're also talking a lot with publishers and working with them to make sure that we're doing it mindful of the way that they've artfully constructed their content, the way that they sustain a business with their listeners and their long-term goals. So I think it's similar to YouTube in terms of some of the use cases that we can have, but also a situation where in the open ecosystem of podcasts, we want to make sure that we're proceeding at the right pace and working with publishers closely to build features that are great for users and also great for publishers, because you really need both in order to take the ecosystem to the next level and sustain the growth that we've been so delighted to see over the past few years.
Absolutely. Does Google Podcasts on either platform have an import feature? A lot of people, will be coming from other apps, other podcast apps and things like that, and may want to try this out. Is this a situation where you will just go and find the podcast that you like and subscribe? Or is there some sort of import feature of the list of podcasts that you listen to in other apps?
So our goal since the beginning has been to introduce hundreds of millions of people around the world to podcasts. And we recognize that the vast majority of those people will not have listened to podcasts before. And so we've thought a little bit less about the experience of switching from an app. And I think yesterday when we launched on iOS, it actually forces us to think a little bit more about that switching experience, because podcasts are a little bit more prevalent on iPhone in terms of the percentage of users who are listening to podcasts. And so we want to make that switching process as easily as possible for people who want to switch. But we're always still going to be focused on users who we can introduce to podcasts and where we can really grow the pie in general. So the short answer to your question is we don't currently have an import feature within the app. What I've found since I've set up a lot of new accounts over the past few months is that the other feature that we have launching this week is the ability to subscribe and manage your subscriptions on the web. And I found that compared to the OPML export, OPML import flow in a lot of apps, it's pretty similarly time consuming if you have, less than 100 subscriptions. Maybe it's more like less than 30 to just search on podcast.google.com for the name of the podcast and then subscribe. And that takes, less than 5-10 seconds per podcast if you have the list in front of you. So if you have, 100 podcasts, you're talking about a little less than 10 minutes probably, which sounds like not that much time when I say it, but I also know as a user that it feels really annoying to have to do things manually. So I'm not trying to make excuses. And I wish actually that there was an even more seamless way to switch between apps than OPML, which I think is somewhat difficult.
Right. It's complicated. Yeah.
And also, it's not friendly to people who aren't really like tech savvy. So one idea I've had that I've been plugging a lot internally, maybe plugging it externally will help us actually build it, is what we should do is, maybe someone else will do it too. That would be cool as well. But hopefully this lights a little bit of a fire. We should be able to import based on any screenshot of cover art. So you can just like go to your library, take a screenshot, go to another app, upload the photo. So I only mention that to say that we've been thinking about it a lot and how to make it more approachable for newer users. And we want to see the industry move forward in general, make it easy for users to choose where they prefer to listen across their devices.
Yeah, that's a wonderful idea. Just the thought of, okay, I go into my my Apple Podcasts library where I can see all the different little squares. I take a screenshot and then that uploads into the Google Podcasts and can automatically subscribe. I will say though, as I'm doing this, I'm finding it handy to be able to prune my very long list of podcast subscriptions down to ones that I actually want to listen to. So there is a little bit of a benefit to doing that manually that I was not expecting. So that's kind of fun. I do appreciate that.
There's another thing that kind of gets into one of the principles of our product that I feel comfortable saying is a long-term principle, which is, in podcasting, if you have like 200 subscriptions, it starts to feel like you're managing it and like it's a lot to manage. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at the way that we've designed the app as of yesterday, what you'll see is that it's designed around making it so that there's never an increased management cost for you because you subscribe to an additional podcast. And if you think about the way you use Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, if you follow 1,000 people or 10,000 people, that doesn't make the experience more clunky and harder to manage. And so we're trying to bring that same level of flexibility to the podcast app, because I think most podcast apps right now, they feel best when you have between maybe 10 and 50 subscriptions, but they start to get unwieldy after that. And we've seen such an explosion in the number, variety, and quality of podcasts available over the last 5 years that we don't want you to have to think, oh, do I have too many subscriptions? We want to manage that smartly for you and help you find the content you love most as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I have one final question for you. I know we got to let you go. A lot of folks right now are sort of focusing more time. They're spending more time at home. They're spending more time away and are not necessarily doing the commute that tends to be the standard method of for at least folks that I know, their podcast listening. And so I'm curious, as a person who's steeped in podcasting in general, and as you in your blog post, you shared about how you have found podcasts in the past and looked to podcasts. What does the current state of sort of podcast listening look like in your mind? How are we listening, and where are we listening? And maybe if you want to give us a little glimpse into your life, how and where are you listening to podcasts?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the blog post because writing that, I got into podcasts while I was in my car, like originally, but then thinking about the activities today that are best suited for podcasts, going to the gym is not something that we're really doing anymore, but cooking dinner might be. And it depends where you are, but going on a run is something that you can still do. And so it's been pretty interesting to see when people are turning to podcasts and how they're turning to podcasts in these strange times. And one thing that's true that a lot of people, I think, don't know is that most podcast listening, or at least the plurality of podcast listening, was already taking place at home. So there is a pretty big base there. And I think what we've seen is obviously a decrease in podcast listening during commutes, since people aren't really commuting, at least, people who aren't going into work are not commuting. And some level of increase in terms of interest in the news, interest in finding authoritative content about what's going on with COVID-19. And so I think we feel a sense of responsibility there in a couple ways. Number one is for people who are interested in finding authoritative, relevant, informative podcasts about what's going on in the world. We want to help them stay informed, and I think you'll see that in the product. And then also for probably a majority of people who actually want to use podcasts as a little bit of an escape, because I think there's a mental health crisis that is not of the magnitude of the public health crisis that we have right now, but is still worth taking very seriously. We want to be able to give them a way to just, spend 30 minutes, spend an hour doing something that was normal before the past month, or in certain parts of the world, the past few months. And so that sense of responsibility, I think, also makes us passionate about getting the new redesign out the door, getting the app out the door on iOS, and just having podcasts available to people. One example for me is I often fall asleep with a podcast on. If I'm reading a book, that's a nice way to fall asleep. And you can kind of turn out the lights in a way where I have to keep a light on if I read a book. So that's something that I've been doing where, maybe before I would listen to a particular podcast while commuting, and now I save it for right before bed. What about you? I'm curious your behavior as well.
Yeah, so I was the right before bed thing, definitely. I routinely fall asleep to podcasts and then sort of pick them up where I left off in the morning, finish them out while I'm getting ready in the morning. Showers, another great time. I'm sort of a connoisseur of fine Bluetooth waterproof speakers because I love to listen to music and podcasts in the shower, and walking the dog and things like walking the dogs rather, and things like that. So yeah, there are plenty of places to still listen to podcasts. And for the folks who are listening to this one, listening to this great interview we've had with you, I'm sure they've got just as many fun places to listen to shows. And like you said, whether you're finding an escape or you are looking for authoritative information, podcasts can be great for that.
You're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. That was Tech News Weekly 126, Google Podcasts app. Next up, from twit.tv, we have a Creative Commons clip. Mac Break Weekly 707, Apple buys Dark Sky.
This is Twit.
Big story that just broke while we were doing iOS today, and it actually is a little disheartening. Apple has bought Dark Sky. That was a shocker. Dark Sky, which is my favorite weather app.
Me too.
And it was on Android. Dark Sky in their blog post said, yeah, we're not going to be on Android anymore. And starting in July 1st. But even more disheartening to me, they're going to kill the API at the end of next year. The API was used by a lot of other apps. You could, even if you used Carrot Weather, you could use the Dark Sky info in your
weather line.
Yeah.
No API, no website, no nothing. It seems it's very, very true to form for Apple that they don't necessarily they bought Dark Sky because they wanted better weather for iPhones. They don't want to get into the multi-platform weather business. But it's. You just wish that they could loosen up a little bit and say, you know what, we will keep at least support for other platforms going, because this wasn't just some early in development tool that they acquired before it could really gain traction. This was really one of the top three you would mention if you were recommending weather apps to people. So it's disappointing that it's being taken off the board for everybody but iOS.
Weather is weird because all weather apps use the same initial source, which is the federal, at least in the U.S., the National Weather Service. They get the information from them, and then they make their forecasts out of it. There are other, Norway has one that's very good that I've used for a long time. What is there a Canadian? There must be a Canadian weather.
Yeah,
service.
We don't have Dark Sky. Like a lot of people were freaking out, and I double checked, and we still don't have it. And it's not. I think it might be U.S. only. The way Pocket Weather was Australia only. Yeah. So I know it has a huge impact on Americans, but a lot of us were going, oh, no, nobody has it.
Yeah, right. So what they've said, and I don't remember if was it Dark Sky or some other one that had a lot of. I don't think it was Dark Sky. They had a lot of. home weather stations as part of their data, which would give them additional information that the weather service did not provide.
I think that was Weather
Underground does that. Yeah.
If you set up a weather station that a lot of different weather station makers support an API that lets you feed hyper-local weather, and that it really is a killer.
Dark Sky had an iOS app. They say for now there'll be no changes to the iOS app for now. It'll continue to be available. The app on Android and Wear OS will no longer be available for download as of right now, and service will end July 1st. If you're a subscriber, because you can pay for this, you'll get a refund, prorated refund. The website will continue until July 1st, 2020. But then you won't be able to get forecasts from it anymore. The API will stay through the end of 2021. And now, all of a sudden, the Apple privacy policy takes effect. In fact, if you go to your iPhone or your iPad, you'll get an update for a Dark Sky. They say it's a bug update, but really it's the Apple privacy policy that you'll have to agree to.
It's interesting, though, like what – because a lot of people are just assuming Apple has bought this, maybe for the talent, but as a way to make a much better weather app for the iPhone. Right now, that pulls Yahoo Weather, I believe. It's still Yahoo Weather.
Which is the worst, by the way, of all of them.
Yeah, but this is hyper-U.S. weather, and Apple's got to solve weather internationally.
Yeah, why did they buy them?
I would have thought they'd...
Yeah, why did they buy them?
Like they would have bought a much larger weather provider than Dark Sky if they really wanted to fix the iPhone weather app.
Well, but again, all the data comes from the National Weather Service, at least in the U.S. So, and you can't buy the National Weather Service.
Yeah.
Although weather.com
they have enough money to try, though.
Yeah. I'm not sure what you get. There must be something besides their forecasts. You're not buying it for the forecasts.
Unless it's just an acqui-hire.
It must be the team, right? Or the API? I'm not sure I really understand.
Well, also, there are two components to really, really good weather apps or really good weather forecasting. Number one is, of course, being able to get access to National Weather Service data and other kinds of data. The second is having meteorologists on staff that know which weather model, which mathematical model to apply to each situation. So perhaps if I'm just blue skying here, if I were at Apple and my job were to make Apple weather the best in the industry standard, the best in the business, I would buy an app that is not just simply a throwaway widget, which is what the built-in app has been. And then I would also, just like Apple acquired a whole bunch of people in sports medicine and health medicine to create their Apple Watch and make sure that these people know it's being developed by people who know their business. I would also be acquiring meteorologists who would then not only have the expertise to be able to create a global weather app, but also have the contacts and the business acumen to create deals with all these other services to say, can we have access to your model for this? We need the New England model is no good because it has nothing to be right now because it doesn't handle hurricanes and coastal weather very well. So we're going to make sure that we have a model for this. So if Apple is really trying to be top notch with weather, it could be not just getting the app, but also that gets in weather data from everybody else, but also again acquiring a team of meteorologists and scientists and climate scientists who know exactly how to really fine tune these things.
You're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan, and that was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at Twit.tv. That was MacBreak Weekly 707, Apple Buys Dark Sky. Next up, Twit.tv Creative Commons clip, Security Now 760, Folding at Home.
This is Twit.
We now can donate our unused CPU cycles to help provide answers to COVID-19. It's a happy coincidence that just as the SETI project decided that it just had no longer any need for the raw signal processing number crunching that all of its users were doing, that a crucial new need for distributed computing at massive scale would arise, because our unused CPU cycles can now help to increase our understanding of the structure and function of the COVID-19 virus. It turns out that molecular modeling can be used to identify therapeutic drugs that might be of use in preventing the COVID-19 spike protein from binding to the ACE2 receptors of the cells in our lungs. In other words, our medical science and molecular modeling technology has progressed to the point that the field of computational biology is now a thing. And oh baby, is it compute intensive. But it's possible to run simulations entirely using very sophisticated math to predict the 3D molecular shape and thus the interactions between biological compounds. Wikipedia has a terrific and up-to-the-date intro that even mentions about folding at home, which is even mentioning COVID-19. They said folding at home, and that's foldingathome.org for those of you who don't want to wait, is a distributed computing project for performing molecular dynamics simulations of protein dynamics. Its initial focus was on protein folding, but has shifted more to biomedical problems such as Alzheimer's disease, cancer, COVID-19, and Ebola. The project uses the idle processing resources of personal computers owned by volunteers who've installed the software on their systems. Folding at Home is currently based at the Washington University in St. Louis School of Medicine under the directorship of Dr. Greg Bowman. The project was started by the PAND Laboratory at Stanford University under the direction of Professor Vijay Pand, who led the project until 2019. Since 2019, Folding at Home has been led by Dr. Greg Bowman, who is a former student of Dr. Pand. They wrote, the project has pioneered the utilization of CPUs, GPUs, PlayStation 3s, message passing interface used for computing on multi-core processors, and some Sony Xperia smartphones. Okay, don't do that. For distributed computing and scientific research. The project uses statistical simulation methodology that is a paradigm shift from traditional computing methods. As part of the client-server model network architecture, the volunteered machines each receive pieces of a simulation, work units, complete them, and return them to the project's database servers, where the units are compiled into an overall simulation. Volunteers can track their contributions on the Folding at Home website, which makes volunteers' participation competitive and encourages long-term involvement. It's like, hey, how many work units have you achieved? You know, and so forth. Folding at Home is one of the world's fastest computing systems. Get a load of this. With heightened interest in the project as a result of the 2019-2020 coronavirus pandemic, the system achieved a speed of approximately 768 petaflops, or 1.5 x86 exaflops at March 25th, 2020, so last Wednesday, making it the world's first exaflop computing system. This level of performance from its large-scale computing network has allowed researchers to run computationally costly atomic-level simulations of protein folding thousands of times longer than formerly achieved. Since its launch on the 1st of October 2000, the Pand Lab has produced 223 scientific research papers as a direct result of Folding at Home. Results from the project's simulations agree well with experiments. So basically, this is doing out on this massive network. As I mentioned to you before, Leo, that the sum of processing power by the world's top 7 fastest supercomputers is less than the current power of the Folding at Home network. Since February, the Folding at Home computer, the community has been working on the computationally heavy work of finding out how the COVID-19 virus protein binds to cells. When the outbreak was picking up steam, the Folding at Home Project asked for volunteers to donate their computers' unused computational power to help accelerate the open science effort to develop new life-saving therapies. As part of a collaboration of multiple laboratories around the world. Folding at Home says, get this, there's been a roughly 1,200% increase in contributors, with 400,000 new members signing up in the past 2 weeks. So I would imagine the listeners of this podcast will probably be responsible for another serious jump in that number. Due to the project basically being swamped recently, the Folding at Home researchers are working to generate enough work for this massive influx of new processing power to tackle. They indicated that there might be a bit of downtime, that is, like people would be looking and their Folding at Home cycles were not being sucked up while new simulations are being set up. They wrote, they said, usually your computer will never be idle, but we've had such an enthusiastic response to our COVID-19 work that you will see some intermittent downtime, meaning lack of use of the resources that you are making available, as we sprint to set up more simulations. Please be patient with us. There is a lot of valuable science to be done, and we're getting it running as quickly as we can. So I would say a very worthwhile effort for those of us who leave machines on and unattended while we're not using them. Let it download little work packets of computational biology to perform, and then get that work done and send the results back to them. We'll all be doing our share. Basically, a mathematical biological laboratory.
You're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan. That was a Creative Commons clip from twit.tv, Security Now 760, Folding at Home. Next up from twit.tv, Creative Commons, This Week in Google 552, Kinsa Fever Map.
This is Twit.
You know, tests are nice, but if you knew fever, if you knew temperatures, you'd know. We wouldn't know what the disease is, but you'd see, and this map does show abnormal or atypical temperature increases. So if I click the atypical button on this, you can see there's some hot spots here, like Weld County, Colorado, and much of Florida.
Florida is unbelievable.
And look where it is. It's on the beach, right? Well, that's not much of a surprise right after spring break. You can also look at Louisiana, and you could see that, there's going to...
Everybody's worried.
There's going to be problems there.
Why Colorado?
Denver? I don't know. I don't know. So, but that's what's
interesting. Maybe it's just a high percentage.
See, that's what's interesting is this is data that isn't related to testing or even hospital. This is you could see.
Is this
New York.
Kinsa?
This is Kinsa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's any fevers. So that's
right.
Normal flu, COVID, strep.
Right. But they know what's typical because they've been doing this for some time. And they know what's atypical. Now. So, we are having a particularly bad flu season, so that's somewhat of the issue. But
what does the brown in California and Washington
it's good. It's normal. It's not. Yeah, and so
they're always feverish in the West Coast.
It's actually less illness in our county, and that to me, I feel like this is because in California we sheltered in place early. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know how you interpret it. But I think
do me a favor. Go back to it for New York versus New Jersey. That was interesting.
Let's.
Can you?
I could zoom in. I think.
Zoom it.
Yeah. And this is where not having a good geography. There's Queens, which is a hot spot, and of course Manhattan. Here's Hudson County, New Jersey, Bergen County. These are all
Bergen
hot
County's
spots.
been our hotspot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's Manhattan. And so you could see Manhattan is
I'm in Somerset County. Can you go west a little bit?
Essex.
A little west,
Morris.
more now down a little bit. No, right there, Somerset.
Yeah, it's
so
a little
it's
bit of
part
a
of
hot
it.
spot. Yeah.
My wife
The
won't even
trend is,
go
though,
to the
look at
store.
this. The illness trend decreased by 4.43%. So you're high, but it's decreasing.
It used to be worse.
Used to be worse. I think what you're seeing a little bit in this is the shelter-in-place stuff working, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I don't know. I mean, look, I'll leave it to somebody with better brains than me to interpret it. But I think what's interesting is that this exists. It's been around for some years.
What if it is being driven by a bunch of people who are worried about COVID coming in and taking their temperature when they feel bad?
That's
right now?
fine. Because
Well,
if,
no,
if
I'm just
they're
saying
sick,
the comps may be different because
right. Well, that's why you need to have
year-over-year
lots of
comps.
them. You have to have lots of them, right?
And you also we need laws that say you can't get fired because your temperature was high. You can't lose your insurance because your temperature was high. We've got to protect people in those ways.
Right.
Well, the challenge with that is people will continue to find new ways to infer and make insights from this data. So do you write laws that try to get ahead of each one of those actions before or after they start like doing the database redlining, for lack of a better term? Or do you create guardrails around how the data can be used in the first place?
I think, Stacey, you build with principles. Rather than trying to anticipate every possible use of the data or hold it, you say there are principles. And the principles are that, I think that sickness should be freedom of keeping your job and not losing your insurance from illness should just be a principle. And wherever the threat comes from, then you're in a better position because you set that principle as a matter of law.
Okay. I would also.
We have
I'll
so much
share this.
agreement. So much humor to
I'm
this.
like, I wrote about this last week. I'm going to ask you to highlight it because it ties to what we're talking about. And this is, if you go to my site, Leo, and now is the time to build a connected medical device framework. The reason is because some people I really respect, they wrote an article in Nature. And in that article, they talk about creating a 5-level framework for remote monitoring. Because part of this is they have a connected sensor fax. What is
so
that
this would
word?
be something
like a nutrition level.
This would be something you would see on your device to know how valid it is.
And they're calling for
they're
calling for 5 things. So validation. So are there peer-reviewed papers and clinical trials for each device saying, hey, they're measuring the right thing to like diagnose disease? The next level of the framework is security practices. Is this device secure? The next is data rights and governance. So who gets your data? Is that clear to people? Blah, blah, blah. The final 2, usability and utility.
Oh, this
is
great.
important for can somebody who's not technically savvy even use this, right? Does your doctor need to be doing, support calls? And then price, price is really fun because depending on who pays for it, the value really can go either way, right? So you might have insurance companies' interests ahead of a consumer's interest in this case, but the point is show people exactly what this looks like.
So you got this from an article in Nature. Is this being proposed?
So this is the FDA on Friday basically said that they're going to allow remote monitoring, but it has none of these safeguards in place.
Yeah, this is.
And so it's a proposal by a group of people, some of whom who've worked for the FDA, some of who are very good security experts, very well respected. So this is a proposal. The article is so long, you guys. I know my article's long, but the Nature article is incredibly long, but it's really excellent. And it's how we should be thinking about this. So I encourage people to weigh in on this because I think it's crucial. Oh, there it is. Ta-da!
Yeah, I would really love to see this. In fact, this makes so much sense. I feel like it's never going to happen, but it's just so obvious, right? It's such a great idea.
Well, and it's not just a great idea. It's really necessary for us to build trust in this kind of system because you have a lot of people, you're asking them to give data that is deeply personal.
Yeah,
I mean, Jeff may have gone on the air talking about AFib, but if he didn't want to, it's not like he'd feel comfortable with that
we have
data.
These kind of labels on food.
Yeah.
So much it makes perfect sense to have it on medical devices. You know, connected medical devices especially.
You're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan, and that was a clip from the good folks at twit.tv, Creative Commons. That was This Week in Google 552, Kinsa Fever Map. Next up from twit.tv, Creative Commons, Windows Weekly 665, Digital Safety.
This is Twit.
Yeah, if you haven't seen this, you should go to the Microsoft 365 blog. They've been publishing an astonishing array of content about working remotely and staying safe, all this stuff, and it's actually pretty incredible. One of the things that they threw up there was about staying safe digitally, and they were talking specifically about the phishing type attacks that are occurring now because of the coronavirus, and that I think the figure was 91% of malware that we get comes through email. And they have a bunch of advice. A lot of it's up, really obvious, stay up to date, et cetera. The most important one in this list to me that you can do as an individual is to use multi-factor authentication on all of your online accounts. If you're not doing this, you got to take the time to do this now, like right now. Like Microsoft account, Google account, every account you have that supports multi-factor authentication, you have to enable this. This is the simplest thing you can do to protect yourself online, or maybe the best thing or whatever. But check out the Microsoft post for all, especially for their email advice. A lot of, the 0-day thing we were talking about earlier is spread via email attachments. People just click, double clicking stuff, like just, maybe practice some common sense, et cetera. But make sure you're using multi-factor authentication as well.
If you Bing protecting against coronavirus-themed phishing attacks.
Nobody does that, Leo.
I was trying to be nice. Just Bing it.
Yeah.
Just Bing it.
Just Bing it.
What did you just say?
I know. I'm sorry. I was
Bing.
just trying to be nice. You search in the search engine of your
Yes.
choice. You can find that because it's a long URL, or you can just go to Thurrott.com and Paul.
Right.
Paul has a link there. Yeah, that's actually. I would imagine every company worth its salt is going to have do what they can to help people, because this is just you got a lot of people going home, a lot of our staff, and they're used to working here with the support of a great IT department and a lot of protection. We have Cisco Umbrella running and all sorts of stuff. They're going home, and the thing I'm most worried about, and I think everybody should be, is. Of course, it's tough right now, but then if these guys get infected and come back to work with their infected laptops, suddenly you're going to see a wave of ransomware and other attacks, because they're bringing them back to the network. They're bringing the virus back.
Hooray!
You can overextend the analogy between computer viruses and malware and COVID-19,
and yet.
There are
parallels. There are reasons we use those terms for both.
I have to say, as most of us, I'm obsessively reading every article I can, and I got to one on Medium written by a guy who said, "I'm an expert in viral growth hacking, so I think I know a little bit about COVID-19." And it's like,
oh boy,
no, you don't.
You're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan. And that was a clip from twit.tv, Creative Commons, Windows Weekly 665, Digital Safety. All right, and with that, I'll wrap up just a little bit early. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join us next Wednesday and every Wednesday to continue this conversation from noon to 1 on Northwest Tech Show.